Business leaders want National Cabinet to issue urgent guidelines on whether employers can direct staff to get a COVID-19 vaccine. There are concerns some could face unfair dismissal claims if workers are sacked for refusing the jab. Joining me to discuss the looming legal minefield is Resolution123 founder and principal Carly Stebbing. Carly, are they rightfully concerned about this?
I think that there needs to be a bit more emphasis on the amount of cooperation there has been to date in a way that we haven't seen before between unions and employer associations, employers and employees. They might be concerned about the fact that there's not an express law that permits them to direct an employee to be vaccinated, but employees have been cooperating with employers around protective equipment, about masks before they were mandated. Employers are entitled to rely on work health and safety legislation to issue lawful and reasonable directions to ensure the health and safety of people at work. So as long as the direction is lawful and it is reasonable, and I think in a lot of circumstances, moving towards a COVIDSafe workplace, vaccinations are going to be part of that program. It's not tested yet, but I think that there's a good cause to consider it lawful and reasonable.
Okay, so just to clarify, as things stand at the moment, do employers actually have the power to get staff to get vaccinated?
There isn't an express law that permits it, but employers have always been able to rely on work health and safety legislation and issue lawful and reasonable directions to employees to ensure the health and safety of the workplace.
And then if they don't?
And if the employee doesn't comply with the direction, then that's when it gets tested, Peter. So that's when it would become an issue of a question before the Commission or the Court about was the direction lawful or reasonable, and the Court and the Commission would have to take into account things like, were they a frontline worker? Were they working with vulnerable people? Was there a reason why the employee had refused the direction?
And would there be different rules for different sectors?
I think that the reality is if you're a frontline worker or you're working with vulnerable, the aged population, for example, then it is more likely to be a lawful and reasonable direction. So I think that in those circumstances, it would be much harder for an employee to refuse that kind of direction if they're working in those environments.
What about if there was another employee who just learned that a colleague is not vaccinated? Do you think they could then have a right to refuse to turn up to work?
I think that that's a real stretch. The only reasonable basis that an employee has to stop work is if there is an imminent risk to their health and safety. And when you consider that the current vaccine scheme that we're talking about in Australia isn't going to prevent the contraction of COVID-19, just serious illness, I think it begs the question about whether or not an employee choosing to cease work because a colleague hasn't been vaccinated is really reasonable. You need to take into account why they weren't vaccinated and also what other protective mechanisms the employer has in place. We've been operating with social distancing for a long time now with the use of protective equipment. So as to whether or not it would be reasonable to stop work, only if there was an imminent risk to their health and safety.
Okay, Qantas boss Alan Joyce has already indicated that passengers won't be allowed on flights if they're not vaccinated. Other venues might deny entry on the basis of vaccination status. So that's something that the Premier of New South Wales is working on at the moment. There's some news about that this morning. Could organisations be opening themselves up to lawsuits as well on that front?
If they discriminate against people because they haven't been vaccinated, I think that there's definitely the news at the moment certainly seems to be that it is more likely to be around incentivising people to be vaccinated than mandating the vaccination. If employers or workplaces or businesses elect to make it a term of entry that you must be vaccinated, and it hasn't been mandated by the government, then I think there is a risk. But that risk would only exist in circumstances where they have discriminated against the person under a head of existing discrimination law. For example, the person hasn't been vaccinated because they have a disability, an illness or an injury that would prevent them from being able to be vaccinated. Then the business might have engaged in indirect discrimination against the person. So it would yes, there is, if it's not mandated, there is some risk, but as to whether or not any claim would be successful, it would have to fall under a head of existing discrimination law.